I'm Samantha Doyle, 32 years old, and I'm standing at the foot of the sweeping staircase in my late grandmother's mansion, where the scent of old wood and rose-scented furniture polish still clings to the walls like memory. The annual Doyle Family Conference has always been a spectacle of wealth and status, and once again, I'm the anomaly. Around me, my cousins glide through the marble foyer like fashion ads come to life, dripping in luxury brands and inherited arrogance. My modest blazer and no-name shoes draw their signature half-laughs and whisper glances, though no one dares to speak it aloud, not directly. For 10 years, I've endured this same theater, nodding politely through dinners where my achievements were ignored or diminished while they flaunted expensive cars and shallow ventures. Little do they know what I carry in my briefcase this year. For the first time in a decade, I've come not to endure, but to reveal. Our family legacy in Boston stretches back nearly a century. A name built from post-war real estate and preserved through a mixture of shrewd investing and shameless brand worship. But while my great-grandfather founded the empire and my grandmother Eleanor expanded it with brilliant tenacity, my uncles and aunts have twisted the family's reputation into something hollow. Grandma Eleanor, the only person in the family who ever looked at me and truly saw me, ran the business with a quiet fire. She wasn't impressed by private jets or limited edition handbags. She believed in value that lasted longer than a headline. While her brothers pushed shiny condo towers and country club memberships, she bought land no one else would touch and nurtured it into quiet profit. I lived with her for 3 years after my parents died in a car crash when I was 15. They were on their way back from a weekend camping trip, and I was supposed to have gone with them, but I had a math competition that weekend. That saved my life and changed it all at once. Grandma took me in when no one else wanted the inconvenience, gave me a room, structure, and purpose. At night, I'd find her in her study balancing ledgers or reading financial trend reports while sipping chamomile tea from a cracked mug. She taught me more about investing than 4 years of business school ever could. She said, money is a tool, not a trophy, and real wealth whispers it doesn't shout. I learned to watch neighborhoods, not just numbers, and to think in decades, not quarters. When she passed away during my senior year of college, she left each of her grandchildren a modest inheritance. While the others used it on sports cars, overpriced art, or parties in Monaco, I invested in undervalued properties, quiet duplexes, forgotten corners of the city poised for renewal. I lived simply, worked 2 jobs, and slowly built a portfolio under anonymous LLC with the help of Grandma's old attorney, Mr. Brennan. By the time I was 28, I owned 10 properties and held minority stakes in 3 commercial lots. By 30, I bought the entire apartment complex where 3 of my cousins now lived, though they didn't know it. Not yet. Now I'm back here at the family's sprawling estate in Brookline, a red-brick Georgian masterpiece set on 5 acres of prime land. It's where Grandma raised generations and tried to pass on a legacy of substance. This mansion was her soul, and now Uncle Malcolm, the self-appointed family patriarch, wants to bulldoze it for a luxury condo development. A betrayal disguised as progress. I arrived early this afternoon, my 10-year-old Toyota tucked sheepishly between Cousin Ava's custom Porsche and Uncle Frank's Bentley. Martha, the housekeeper, who's been with the family for decades, opened the door before I could even knock, her eyes lighting up with warmth that hadn't aged a day since I was 15. "Miss Samantha," she whispered, embracing me like time had paused. "You look more like Miss Eleanor every year." Her words choked something in my throat. "I'm just trying to do her proud," I managed, blinking hard. The old blue guest room where I'd lived still smelled like lavender and books. Nothing had changed. The same bookshelf lined with dusty paperbacks, the worn leather armchair where Grandma used to read, the creaky window overlooking her rose garden that still bloomed every June. I sat there, clutching the folder that held the documents proving I owned nearly $70 million in real estate assets, and yet had never once been asked by this family about my opinion on anything. Last week, I received word that Malcolm planned to push the vote to sell the mansion during this year's conference, citing liquidation of underperforming legacy assets. Their plan was to demolish the house and replace it with glass and steel apartments marketed to foreign investors, exactly the kind of soulless vision Grandma warned me about. My cousin Ava was the first to greet me that evening at dinner. "Oh, hey, Sam," she said, air kissing the air near my cheek. "You made it. You didn't Uber here, right?" I smiled and said nothing. Malcolm gave me the usual half-nod when I entered the dining room, already seated at the head of the table where Grandma once presided with quiet grace. His voice boomed across the table like a CEO at a shareholders' meeting. "Before we begin the weekend sessions, I'd like to acknowledge the success of our top-performing branches this year." He gestured to Ava, who preened like a trophy poodle. "Our investment into DeLuca Towers exceeded projections. Congratulations, Ava." Applause rippled politely. Then he looked down the table at me. "And Samantha, nice to see you made it." That was it. I took my seat across from Cousin Ethan, who offered a nod of sympathy. "So," he said with a grin, "you still doing freelance work?" I fought the urge to laugh. "Sure," I replied, "something like that." Uncle Frank chimed in a few seats down. "You know, Sam, there's still time to come work with the family office. We could use someone in admin. Solid benefits." "Thanks, I'll think about it," I said coolly. No one asked me what I'd been up to. No one asked if I owned anything, managed anything, built anything. To them, I was still the orphaned niece who lived quietly, didn't show off, didn't count. But what none of them knew yet is that I own the roof over several of their heads, that I've built a portfolio with better returns than any of Malcolm's over-leveraged towers, and that this time I didn't come to watch them vote away my grandmother's legacy. I came to stop them. And by tomorrow, when I show them the truth, the poor cousin they've dismissed for a decade will become the one voice they can't afford to ignore. Grandma, wherever you are, I hope you're watching. Because this time, I'm not just carrying your wisdom, I'm wielding it. The next morning dawned with the kind of bright, brittle sunlight that makes everything look more honest than you want it to. I sat by the window in Grandma's old blue guest room, watching the gardeners trim hedges along the driveway while my cousin's luxury cars glittered in the early light. My heart was beating a little too fast, but I forced myself into stillness. Today was the day. The official conference sessions would begin at 9 sharp in the drawing room, and Malcolm had already sent out a smug email outlining the schedule. Financial performance reviews, updates from various branches of the Doyle legacy, and, finally, discussion of generational asset optimization. Translation: selling Grandma's mansion for a quick multi-million-dollar flip. I dressed carefully, choosing a pale gray pantsuit that whispered rather than shouted. No labels, no shimmer, just quiet confidence. I clipped on Grandma's pearl earrings and ran a brush through my hair, staring at my reflection for a long time before heading downstairs. The house was already humming with activity. Staff darted between rooms with trays of coffee and pastries, while my cousins mingled on the patio in oversized sunglasses and logoed loafers. The conference wasn't just a business meeting, it was performance art. Everyone playing their part. And, until now, I'd been the one in the background. Today, I would change that. The drawing room had been transformed overnight. The heavy drapes drawn open to flood the space with natural light, the long walnut table polished to a high gloss and ringed with upholstered chairs. Name cards had been placed at each seat in calligraphy that tried too hard to feel personal. Mine was, of course, at the far end of the table. I took my seat and opened the leather folder I'd brought with me. Inside were the carefully prepared documents from Mr. Brennan, listing every property I owned, every LLC I controlled, and the complete portfolio valuation that would make most of my relatives gasp. But I wasn't here to gloat. I was here to protect what mattered. Malcolm stood at the head of the table, wearing a navy suit so sharp it looked like it could draw blood. "Let's begin," he said, tapping his knuckles on the table like a gavel. "As you know, we've had an exceptional year across most divisions. Doyle Commercial has expanded into 2 new markets. The fundraising gala exceeded projections, and our art collection was recently reappraised at nearly double its previous valuation." Around the table, nods of approval rippled like synchronized swimmers. But we must keep evolving, and that's why I want to open with the proposed reallocation of legacy assets, namely, this property. He gestured around the room as if it were already rubble. "We've received a strong offer from North Point Developments to purchase the estate and adjacent land," Malcolm continued. "They've proposed a mixed-use complex featuring private residences, retail space, and a luxury wellness center. Estimated ROI is significant, especially when adjusted for market projections over the next 5 years." I watched as folders were handed down the table, containing architectural renderings of the glass and steel monstrosity they wanted to build over Grandma's rose garden. "I know this house holds some sentimental value," Malcolm added, in the same tone one might use to describe a mildly embarrassing childhood photo. "But emotions should never interfere with sound financial strategy. We must think of the future." My cousins murmured agreement. Ava leaned over to whisper something smug to Victoria. I didn't need to hear it to know it was about me. But I stayed silent. Let them talk. Their laughter wouldn't last long. Malcolm gestured to the side of the room, where a projector screen now displayed a bar chart of individual financial contributions to the family portfolio. "As usual, we'll proceed in order of total contributions. Brad, you're up first." My cousin Brad stood with the smirk of a man who had never worked for anything he owned. He launched into a presentation about a waterfront development project in Miami that was supposedly transformational, though anyone who paid attention knew it had already overrun budget twice and faced zoning challenges. Still, the room nodded along as if he'd just cured a disease. One by one, my cousins presented. Ethan showed off his new fintech app that had no users but had somehow attracted millions in investor money. Victoria detailed her philanthropic fund, which mostly sponsored exclusive galas and glossy social media posts. And Ava proudly announced her art exhibit curated by someone she'd paid to tell her what was trendy. When it was finally my turn, Malcolm didn't even look up from his notes. "Samantha, if you'd like to share your update," he said, already half dismissing me. I stood, walking slowly to the front of the room, the leather folder still tucked under my arm. The air shifted slightly. Maybe it was the fact that I was wearing something tailored. Maybe it was just the way I moved, but I felt their eyes on me in a way they never had before. "Thank you," I said evenly. "Before I begin, I want to take a moment to acknowledge Grandma Eleanor. This house was her heart. This family was her work. And what she taught me about value wasn't just financial. It was ethical, strategic, enduring." I paused. "She once told me the problem with flash is that it burns out, but substance builds legacy." I opened the folder and pulled out the first set of documents. Over the last decade, I've quietly built a portfolio based on the principles she taught me. As of last quarter, I own 14 residential properties, 3 commercial sites, and hold control and interest in a property management firm operating under 5 different LLCs. A ripple of confusion moved through the room. Malcolm straightened in his seat. Brad blinked like he'd misheard. I clicked the projector remote and a new slide appeared, my own net worth chart. The tallest bar belonged to me. "I currently hold a portfolio valued at $73 million, I said clearly, "with projected year-end growth of 9%. Silence. A silence so complete you could hear Ava's bracelet clink as she fidgeted. Then came the questions. Angry. Disbelieving. "That's not possible." "Where did you get the capital?" This must be a mistake. I let them talk over each other for a moment before holding up a hand. "I didn't ask for family capital. I didn't need your network. I invested my inheritance, lived simply, and used the compounding advantage of being underestimated. You thought I was small. That made it easier to move without noise." Then I revealed the final slide. The title deed to the apartment complex where Victoria and Blake currently lived, under a management firm they'd been mocking for the past year. "You've been living in one of my properties," I said, looking directly at them. "And every rent check, every maintenance request, every complaint about hallway paint or elevator wait times, it all came to me." Brad's mouth hung open. Victoria dropped her pen. I turned back to the room. "You talk about family legacy like it's measured in square footage and wine cellars, but you've forgotten what Grandma built this for. It wasn't to be sold to the highest bidder. It was to last." I reached for the final folder. "Which is why I've acquired, through Elizabeth's Legacy Trust, a controlling stake in the family holding company via silent purchases over the last year. I now hold 36% voting power, which means the sale of this mansion is no longer on the table." The silence that followed was seismic. I didn't smile. I didn't gloat. I simply returned to my seat, the sound of heels clicking softly across the wood floor. No one spoke. No one laughed. And just like that, the poor cousin they'd ignored had become the one person who could stop them. "Grandma, I hope you heard all of that, because I think this was only the beginning." That night the house was quieter than I'd ever heard it. Dinner was served as usual: white asparagus soup, seared halibut, a citrus tart that no one touched, but the atmosphere had shifted. My relatives, who once filled the room with loud laughter and louder opinions, now spoke in low voices, their eyes flickering toward me like I was some kind of corporate ghost haunting the mansion. I ate calmly, listening, watching. And when the plates were cleared and the last spoonful of bitterness swallowed in silence, I stood and excused myself without waiting for anyone else to rise. I walked back to the blue guest room slowly, letting my heels tap across the marble floors like a gavel. Upstairs, I turned the lock behind me, exhaled, and sat by the window that looked over the dark lawn and the roses I'd protected. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt exhausted and alive. In the reflection of the glass, I didn't see the quiet girl they had always underestimated. I saw a woman who had learned to outgrow the hunger for approval and found strength in her own shadow. The next morning came with fog rolling over the estate, wrapping the hedges and fountains in silence. I wore black slacks and a cream blouse and skipped the necklace. Today wasn't for show. Today was for legacy. Downstairs, the drawing room had been reset for the final session. No developers, no real estate offers, just the family and a new dynamic none of them were quite ready to admit. Malcolm stood as I entered, still clinging to the edges of formality. "Samantha, good morning." I returned the greeting with a nod and took my seat. Jessica smiled at me from across the table, eyes calm. She'd been the only one who hadn't looked at me like I was a Trojan horse yesterday. The others, well, I imagined they'd spent the night calculating how to pivot. Malcolm opened the meeting with a summary of the previous day's revelations, his voice carefully measured, but beneath the tone I could hear it a slight hesitation, like a man realizing he was no longer holding the pen to the family story. "I think we can all agree," he said, eyes sliding over to me, "that Samantha's contributions deserve further consideration in how we define Doyle leadership moving forward." There it was, the beginning of their rebranding, trying to fold me into their structure now that they couldn't exclude me. I nodded once, not taking the bait. "In light of Samantha's acquisition of a controlling vote through Elizabeth's Legacy Trust," Malcolm continued, "I'd like to propose a new governance model, one that recognizes all forms of contribution capital, community impact, and stewardship." His words floated in the air like a peace offering dipped in gold. I waited. Let the silence stretch. Then I spoke, slowly, each word deliberate. The trust was never about taking control for myself. It was about restoring balance. This family has turned Grandma's vision into a mirror just to admire itself. But she believed in purpose over prestige. If we're going to move forward, it has to be on new terms. Aunt Catherine leaned forward, her tone soft but carefully practiced. "And what would those terms be, dear?" I met her gaze without flinching. "Transparency, real equity, and a commitment to community reinvestment, starting with the mansion. I'm not selling it. I'm converting it into the headquarters for a new foundation, Elizabeth's Legacy House. It will host financial literacy programs, scholarships, and community workshops. Something real, something lasting." The room went very still. Then Brad, predictably, broke the silence. "So you're just taking the mansion? That's your big move?" I turned to him calmly. "No, I'm giving it back to what it was meant to be." Victoria crossed her arms, skeptical. "And what about the rest of us? What do we get?" I looked around the table, my voice even. "You get to decide if you want to be part of a legacy that means something, or part of a footnote that history forgets. That choice is yours." No one spoke for a long time. Then Jessica leaned back in her chair and said, "I'm in." And that simple statement cracked the ice. Others nodded, muted at first, uncertain, but they were listening now. After the meeting, Malcolm approached me privately in the corridor near the old grandfather clock that Grandma once wound every Sunday morning. His face was unreadable. "You blindsided us," he said, not with anger, but a kind of rueful respect. "You played a long game." I nodded. I learned from the best. He studied me a moment longer. "You're more like Eleanor than any of us." I didn't answer, because I didn't need to. The silence between us said enough. That afternoon, I walked through the mansion room by room, taking stock. Not of furniture or chandeliers, but of the spirit of the place, the photos, the smell of cedar in the old linen closets, the small piano bench where I used to sit and listen to Grandma hum while reading reports. In the west parlor, I found the box of ledgers she kept tucked behind books, handwritten notes, rent rolls, sketches of affordable housing plans she never got to finish. I ran my hand across the fragile pages, tears stinging unexpectedly. She had trusted me to understand, and I had. That evening, as the family packed at leave, the usual chatter about flights and chauffeurs felt different, less smug, less sure. Brad didn't look me in the eye. Victoria gave me a stiff goodbye, which was more than I expected. Malcolm shook my hand, offering a wry, "Let's talk again soon." And Jessica? She hugged me in the driveway and whispered, "You did it." I smiled. We did. Later, I stood alone in the garden, looking up at the windows of the room I'd grown up in. The house was still. The roses bloomed in the fading light. And for the first time in my life, I didn't feel like a guest here. I felt like a Doyle. 3 months later, I stood in the grand ballroom of what was once just a family mansion and was now officially Elizabeth's legacy house. The chandeliers still glimmered with the same warm light Grandma loved, but beneath them stood an entirely new gathering, no longer just the Doyles, but city council members, nonprofit leaders, teachers, single mothers, and young entrepreneurs who had come to witness the launch of something far more important than another real estate venture. Outside, a new bronze plaque shimmered under the winter sun, inscribed with the words, "In memory of Eleanor Doyle, for those who build quietly." The transformation had been subtle but radical. The dining hall now hosted community strategy meetings. The library had become a co-working space for youth startups. Grandma's sunroom was converted into a scholarship counseling center, and the old rose garden had been restored with benches for reflection and late-night conversations that I hoped would change someone's trajectory the way hers had once changed mine. As I moved through the crowd that morning, offering handshakes and soft smiles, I could feel it in the air, purpose blooming inside walls once filled only with performance. Behind me, a familiar voice spoke low but sincere. "You get it, Sam." I turned to find Jessica in a navy coat, a small paper folder clutched in one hand and pride gleaming quietly in her eyes. "No," I said, smiling. "We did it." She laughed, the sound soft and grateful. "Brad's still talking about trying to launch a development in Austin," she added. "He says it's your fault he has to prove himself now." I grinned. "He'll survive." "And Malcolm?" "Still calling once a week, trying to pitch ideas wrapped in flattery." I paused. "But now he listens first. That's new." Jessica nodded, then handed me the folder. Inside were handwritten thank you notes from the scholarship applicants, some of them now interns at the foundation. One note caught my eye. In purple ink, it read, "Miss Doyle, thank you for making a space where someone like me feels seen. I want to be a CEO too one day, but one who remembers where I came from." My throat tightened unexpectedly. That was it, wasn't it? Not the portfolio, not the revelation, but the ripple, the impact that didn't show up on family bar graphs. Later that afternoon, I walked alone through the corridors, now warm with new voices and purpose. I paused at Grandma's portrait in the west hallway. Someone had polished the frame recently. I touched the corner of the canvas gently and whispered, "You were right. Not just about the numbers or the patience, but about legacy. About the kind that lives beyond you and someone else's courage." That night, I drove back to my apartment, the same one with creaky floors and a tiny kitchen, but also the place where I made every investment decision that built my empire. I parked the Toyota beneath the same flickering streetlight and laughed when someone new to the building asked me again if I needed help affording rent. I simply said, "No, I'm good," and meant it. Because that, I realized, was the quiet victory I'd been chasing all along, not their approval, but the ability to walk into any room, any street, any silence, and know I didn't need to explain myself to anyone anymore. In the months that followed, the foundation grew faster than I expected. News outlets ran features on the Doyle heiress who kept her fortune hidden in plain sight. The press called it a story of modern legacy. I called it long overdue correction. Invitations came from business schools, civic boards, financial panels. But I said yes only when it aligned with the values I had fought to preserve. The rest I declined politely because I no longer measured my worth by appearances or accolades. I measured it by impact. One evening, while reviewing grant applications in my office, I received a letter with no return address. Inside was a single sentence typed neatly on cream paper. "Real wealth is invisible. You've made it visible again." There was no signature, but I knew somehow that someone else who had once been overlooked understood. At the next family gathering, held not in the grand mansion but in a modest garden courtyard behind the new foundation building, the energy was different. No more designer runway arrivals, no more slideshows of quarterly performance. Instead, laughter, stories, a few awkward reconciliations. Even Brad, ever theatrical, brought a modest bottle of wine and offered a toast to quiet empires. We all raised our glasses, and no one flinched when I stood to speak. "I used to think the only way to be seen was to shout," I said, letting my voice carry just enough. "But it turns out the most powerful moves are the ones you make quietly until no one can ignore the outcome." I didn't need applause. Just knowing they finally listened was enough. Years from now, they may forget the numbers, the press, the confrontation in the drawing room that changed everything. But what I hope they'll remember, what I've built this entire legacy around, is this: power that isn't shared dies in the hands that hoard it. But when you pass it on, when you build something that lifts someone else, that's when it becomes something immortal. So, if you've ever felt underestimated, overlooked, or told to sit at the kids' table while others make decisions that affect you, know this: your worth was never theirs to define. Your story? That's yours to write. And if my journey has shown anything, it's that the most extraordinary transformations don't begin with applause. They begin with a decision. A quiet, firm, unshakable decision to rise, even when no one's watching. And if you ever need to borrow courage, just remember the girl in the Toyota who once owned half the city, and no one knew until she decided it was time they did.